Welcome back to Practically Political. I'm Dave Spencer. As always, it's great to have you with us.
And I'm Carrie Sheffield. Let's get right to it. Excited to have everybody here. And we've got a special guest for Practically Political. It's my friend and former colleague from Independent Women's Forum, Mandy Gunasekara. And Mandy is the author of this brand spanking new book called Y'all Fired. She's from Mississippi, hence the Southern Belle. It's called A Southern Belle's Guide to Restoring Federalism and Draining the Swamp. And Mandy was former President Donald Trump's chief of staff at the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, which was a wild ride. And she shares what happened. And we are poised here heading into the election for another wild ride if Trump wins again. So, Mandy, thanks for joining us here on Practically Political.
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. And it's wonderful to be with you and Dave.
Mandy, it's great to have you here. And I know you've sort of been in the inner workings of the Trump administration, so I always like to ask sort of to get a grounding as to where we are. But do you believe that Joe Biden won the 2020 election?
Yeah, in effect, ultimately, he took the White House. But I'll tell you this: I was in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania. I was a part of the Lawyers for Trump, and I was a part of after the election day in 2020, where we were doing provisional ballots going back and forth. And if back then, I'm not sure if it's the same now. I think it is, but there were 4 requirements for a provisional ballot to be counted. This included the signing of an affidavit by the voter testifying under consequence of law that they had not voted anywhere else, checking the signature, and then also checking the address of where they actually lived. And so I was a part of a team. There were about 8 to 12 of us, depending on the day, that spent about a week after the election in Pennsylvania, painstakingly going through each of those provisional ballots. And there were quite a few that should not have been counted because either the affidavit was not signed, the signature did not match, or the address very clearly was someone who did not live in the county and in some instances did not even live in the state of Pennsylvania.
Well, let's talk about what's going to happen, because this is really a policy debate when it comes down to it. And one of the things that really concerns me is I hear so many people, and even people that don't follow this stuff as closely as we do, saying, "Oh, we survived Trump once, we'll survive him again. He could have put people in jail for 4 years, but he didn't." And all this stuff is overblown. And my point is that the guardrails that were there, both the guardrails within his institution, like the Mattises and even people like his attorney generals, are going to be gone. And the institutional guardrails, the other kind of guardrails, have been weakened in terms of the Supreme Court's immunity ruling and a lot of other stuff. So is there any concern you folks have when he talks about, the real threat is the enemy from within? Does that concern you at all, Mandy, or is this just alarmism?
No, I agree. I think there are enemies within. I mean, an enemy doesn't necessarily mean that to remove that threat to the.
No, but that's not my question. I'm saying, do you think that a Trump second term is just me like a Trump first term, and that there's nothing for us to worry about? And those of us who think that the guardrails being gone could lead to some real threats to democracy, you're not concerned about that?
No, a lot of that is hyperbolic, electioneering, and it's meant to distract away from what you started out. I agree with we should focus on, which are the policies. There's a lot there. But to President Trump's point, I mean, this is what my book is about. It's called The Deep State, and it's the rise of the unelected bureaucrat, subverting and minimizing the role of the individual voter and the liberties that we are all guaranteed by virtue of being citizens of this country. So a lot
how
of
does that
times.
happen? Because more people voted in the last election than ever. We should have been giving ourselves, and Carrie's heard me say this many times, we should be giving ourselves a collective pat on the back, because in the middle of a pandemic, we ran what the Trump administration called, before Chris Cobb was fired, the safest, most secure election ever. And we had record turnout, and we did it in the middle of a huge pandemic. But because the narcissistic little man boy couldn't handle the fact that he lost, for the first time ever, somebody tried to block the peaceful transfer of power.
Dave,
and it's
I
way
don't
more
think,
sacred.
Dave, I don't think that's what my interpretation of what Mandy's talking about
No,
is
no, but I'm just asking her about
Mandy's talking about
specifically to the deep
Mandy's
state.
talking
I'm asking her about the guardrails.
Mandy's talking about the unelected bureaucrats. They are the threat to democracy. The fact
Yes.
that you
Yeah,
had
but how?
bureaucrats who were undermining the duly elected president, that is a threat to democracy. And
Okay,
so
wait.
the fact
Okay.
that Mandy's book is called Y'all Fired, that's what needs to happen. If Trump wins, we got to have some cleaning house here, because that unelected bureaucracy that Mandy calls the deep state, that is the threat to democracy, because a president has the right to enact his or her policies as under the democratic process to put that person in the White House.
And when
Yeah.
which policies were not which policies was he not allowed to elect? The problem was he was so legislatively incompetent. The only thing that was ever passed was that awful tax act. Okay, I mean, whatever you want to say about Biden, and I have a lot of problems with some of the stuff he did. And my point has always been this election is not about supporting and electing Joe Biden or even Kamala Harris. It's defeating Donald Trump, because I'm an old fashioned Republican. I want to get back, at least try to get back to the party of Reagan. This is populism. This is not the traditional Republican Party. And even people, those who, I know so many people who are supporting Trump are saying, God, I just wish we could get back to Reagan when we had sensible immigration and when we were pro free trade and when we had an alliance based foreign policy and all this stuff. So even if you're not a supporter of Kamala Harris, now that the Republicans are going to control the Senate, all this doomsday stuff about packing the Supreme Court and adding states and all this drama queen stuff is not going to happen.
Yeah, I would say two things. One point I just don't want to let totally go is there was a peaceful transition of power, and I was a part of that.
January 6th?
I resigned on January 20th at noon, which is consistent with what every administration, I believe, at least in modern history, every administration has done. And we had all packed up, moved out, and left our offices and the relative roles. And Team Biden, they actually came in. There was a short period of time where there were careers that were left in charge to keep the trains going on time at the various agencies and even within the White House. A lot of that is your traditional administrative. So all of that actually occurred.
But will you at least acknowledge that Donald Trump tried to block the peaceful transfer of power? That's never happened before. If he'd had his way, there wouldn't have been a peaceful transfer of power. And that's my point. These guardrails are now gone. We don't forget, 2 weeks before the election, he ordered Bill Barr to arrest Joe Biden. I mean, people forget of what tried to happen, and you folks are just shrugging it off like it's no big deal. Don't worry, it'll be fine.
Dave, like literally, Donald Trump has been prosecuted by Joe Biden. Joe Biden is the threat to democracy.
We're talking about blocking. This is all stuff.
Dave, okay, Dave, you know what? I thought we were going to have Mandy to talk about the EPA, to talk about energy policy. I think we're getting derailed here, in my opinion.
But this is an important thing.
It is. I agree. It's important. Can I say one other thing, Dave? There's something please. we do actually agree on, and it is the role of Congress. And actually, like segueing it back into my book, my argument is overall you should have a smaller administrative state, and Congress should actually be more powerful. I was looking into this. I wrote an op-ed that I'm going to submit in a couple days. But if you look at just from a budgetary perspective, and remember, the legislative branch between the House and the Senate, that is the voice of the American people in the policy making process. And over time, that voice has been diminished by the growth of administrative agencies that have billion to $100 billion budgets. Whereas if you look at Congress, all of Congress, the legislative branch alone, they have they have tens of billions-dollar budget. That's not the best way to really paint the picture. I think the best way is the number of total full-time employees. You have 2.9 million full-time employees across the federal workforce. The legislative branch includes around 32,000 total, and a lot of that includes people who engage in non-policy making actions. But Congress is charged with oversight of the administrative state. How in the world is a small handful of tens of thousands of people at best going to perform adequate oversight to keep the administrative state in check when you have agencies that continually take actions that go beyond their legal mandates? EPA is ground zero for this type of activity, and they even ignore very clear decisions from the Supreme Court time and time again, or they pursue political goals versus instituting and implementing actions consistent with their stated mission. So if we want to get back, I would actually charge, we don't need to get back to the days of Reagan. We need to get back to the days of the founding principles of a constitutional republic that is consistent with checks and balances that are so important. And as the administrative state has grown over time for a number of actions, that balance has gotten out of whack, ultimately diminishing the role of the individual and degrading individual rights that are so important to our constitutional
Well, let
republic.
me just add one thing to that because I think we agree on that. But people like George Will, by the way, have been saying for years that the legislative branch has been voluntarily ceding power to the
Yes,
executive branch. Okay, so we
yes,
will definitely we agree on that. Secondly, the Supreme Court has also muddied the waters. Now, we can have an honest debate on the merits or what the true impact of that immunity ruling is. But I think most people who are objective say, A, the Supreme Court shouldn't have even taken the case. And if they did, at the very best way you can spin it is they've made it much more ambiguous. And they've made it much easier for the president to try to push the limits of the line because you can say that anything is under the guise of executive power. So a lot of the other, and then the court wonders why they're their reputation is at an all-time low. So this has been and it's been a great mystery to me why these two other branches have voluntarily ceded power to the executive branch. But again, if you folks are talking about paring back the state, I have a feeling that you might be referring to Schedule F. Okay, right now the president, just for our viewers, is allowed to replace about 4,000 workers when he or she comes in. That we're talking about 50,000 workers, and again, we're not talking about these people. There are probably a few people that you mentioned that are these so-called deep state. I think the deep state, just to be tangential for a second, is not what Trump says it is. The conspiracy, the deep state is a bureaucracy, and we deal with this the most in California. I mean, you've got to get 79 different permits to build a building in San Francisco. That's the deep state. But putting that
right.
aside, okay, I think that the branches are liable to this, but that still doesn't change our basic argument that he's wiser. He has a bunch of enablers. I mean, you think about people instead of Rex Tillerson and John Kelly, we're going to have Michael Flynn and Kash Patel, and if that doesn't strike just a sheer shudder down people's spines, I don't know what does. So that's what we need to talk about. And I think that people are just sweeping that under the carpet.
Yeah, well, I would say there are a lot of people that worked in the first Trump administration that are geared up and ready to go and work in the second. And me personally, you could characterize me in that group of folks. I'm not intending to go back. I live in Mississippi now. I've left DC, and I'm building my solid rock foundation down south for a lot of reasons. Two of them being my young children, that I want to be more involved in their lives. But I think that there is a learned wisdom, and early on in the administration, there was a lot of lost time. Looking at EPA, I can speak personally about EPA. The early days, we lost a lot of time trying to get time. There's something called a stay that you can apply for pending litigation. You tell the court, hey, we're rethinking this regulation. We know there are these pending cases, but if you could just hold off the implementation of it while we fix it in whatever way we think is consistent with the law and technically sound, can you put the litigation in hold? We spent probably 2.5 months of those early days. Those first 100 days are crucially important, trying to get more time. And at the end of the day, the DC Circuit ruled against all of that, and then we were back at square one. So there's things like that procedurally that political appointees it didn't learn until you were on the inside looking out versus the outside looking in. So I do think, I mean, this may strike fear in your heart, but I actually think it's a sign of the government acting in the way that it's supposed to, where it is responsive to new leadership, and that leadership is put there by virtue of the American voter. That you are going to actually see these sorts of things implemented much more efficiently because of that learned wisdom and not taking missteps. And missteps, mind you, the deep state, and when I say that, I'm talking about the entrenched political class and civil servants, mostly housed in Washington, D.C., but the ones that don't see their role as a civil servant, they see it as either instituting their own personal agenda or the personal agenda of a political ideology they're affiliated with, which is not, that's not their role. If someone wants to do that, there's a lot of other roles you could take in DC, but civil servant shouldn't be where you ultimately land. All that being said, the learned wisdom of the first Trump administration, if there's a second one, they're going to be much more efficient. They're going to be ready to go. And the goal, I mean, a goal, I think is a laudable goal. The Biden administration on day one appointed 2,000 political appointees. That's frankly impressive. And the Trump administration, I think it would behoove them to try on day one to get as many politicals in those various positions to start instituting the various agenda and policies that the president has laid out in a number of applications on the campaign trail.
Do you think that former President Trump is going to respect the outcome of the election? Because you've just talked so much about the will of the voters being important and people's interests being represented in, you know, the House of the people and all this, but he clearly didn't, with whether it was the fake elector scheme or whether it was trying to hang, saying that he didn't care whether Mike Pence was hanged, because, by the way, J.D. Vance said that he would not have certified the election, so that gives you an idea. And so I guess my point is, do you think he's going to respect the outcome of the election because he's committed not to do that, or he won't commit to do that? And you can always tell when things may not be going so well in a state, because I just heard yesterday that he's complaining that the vote in Pennsylvania is going to be rigged. Heck, he said in 2016 it was going to be rigged because he thought he was going to lose. So is he going to respect the outcome of the election?
Yes.
What proof do you have? He hasn't committed to it. He hasn't done it in the past. There are all these lawsuits that are brewing. He said, like some little kid along with his little sidekick, Mike Johnson, we have a deal. We won't tell you what it is till after the election, but we have a deal. None of that stuff makes you nervous. You think he'll just, you can see him saying, oh, I wish Kamala all the best.
Yeah, I think he
Come
will.
Come on. Seriously?
He will respect the outcome of the election just like he did in 2020.
Just like he
Where
did in
again,
2020. He
there was
did in
there was a
2020.
peaceful there when there was a
He
peaceful
lost.
transition. There was a
He still
peaceful
won because
transition
he
of power.
lost.
Again, there's a lot of rhetoric. There's a lot of hypotheticals that didn't ultimately materialize, and I think when it's hard to sometimes sift the
But
truth
he
versus the
tried. Will you
noise.
at least acknowledge that he tried to
That
overturn it?
the truth versus the noise, you look at the actions, and what President Trump did is he asked questions. There were a lot of irregularities. Again, I was in Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, and I saw them firsthand, and
But
I had a lot of
nothing that would
colleagues.
have changed the outcome of the election, Mandy. Nothing that would have changed the outcome of the
But
election.
but what he did is he asked questions that the Democrat Party has been asking for forever. Do you think Hillary Clinton ever accepted the outcome of the 2016
Hillary
election?
Clinton, are you serious?
See
Hillary
this?
Clinton, the night of the election, Hillary Clinton conceded. The next morning, Hillary Clinton said, Donald Trump is our president. I mean, you folks are
No,
so
but even
detached from reality. You're forgetting what transpired. The next week, Barack Obama had Donald Trump in the Oval Office. I just can't believe that you guys are rewriting history here.
We're not. We're
Did,
reminding you of a
did
lot of the
Hillary Clinton
rhetoric.
concede the night of the election? Yes or no?
But
He
but
did.
then what did she do in her actions? She questioned it. She called him an illegitimate president.
But that's all
She
words. She didn't try to actually.
exactly
It's
words
different, Mandy.
ultimately don't matter. What happened? There was
Publicly you concede. Okay, that's what our democracy is based on. You have to be able to get up and say that you lost. Hillary Clinton called Trump up the night of the election and conceded. The next morning at a press conference, she said Donald Trump is our president. So yeah, maybe behind the scenes she said I was rooked or it should have worked out better. But
It wasn't.
in
It was on
public, when it
national news.
mattered,
And then
she
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 initiated the
conceded.
whole Russia investigation via her campaign and the
The whole
dossier and
I
feeded them.
we're not getting in. There's good proof
But
on the
those are the
Russia.
actions.
But
Like,
you're throwing these red herrings in here. The bottom line
I
is
don't think it's a red herring.
this
I
is
think it's
the
very relevant.
but every single time it's like saying, well, Terry McAuliffe said that there were some illegitimate voters, or in 2016, some Hollywood actors said that the electors shouldn't certify the election. That's all talk. That's not trying to undermine a free and fair election. That's not inciting an insurrection. I mean, I got to say, you Trumpsters are just masters of the false equivalency. I mean, it is beautiful. Anyway, Carrie, you say something. I've been doing all the talking.
Well, look, yeah, I think I agree with Mandy, because at the end of the day, on January 6th, which was a horrible day for our country, Trump did say march peacefully.
Oh,
He did not incite anything, Dave. And I know we've talked about this over and over,
please,
but
you can believe that all you
I'd
want.
rather talk about policy, and I'd rather not talk about this anymore, because at the end of the day,
Yeah, because you're losing the argument.
NBC News just came out with new polling on policy proposals, and they asked them their top response to strong support. The question was, are you more or less likely to support a candidate? And they gave different issues. Their top yes was, I'm more likely to support expanding domestic oil and natural gas production.
Correct.
I'm just
And
wondering.
we're pumping more energy now than we ever had. And
Yes.
Joe Biden, by the way, let me just say this because you bring up a very good point. One of my complaints, and has gone to both parties, is it seems like we've had one party that's against fossil fuels, one party that is against alternative energy. I've always said, let's go full speed ahead on both. And Biden very quietly has done that. He's invested more than we ever have in alternative fuels, which I think we need to do. But we're also pumping more oil and gas than we ever have. Now, he can't say it. He can't be very vocal about it because he's going to offend his base, but he deserves credit for that. And by the way, there was a poll that was taken where they asked voters about the issues, not who's supporting it. They said, are you in favor of X? Are you in favor of Y? Are you in favor of Z? And if you took out the candidate, okay, which takes out the tribalism, the partisanship, more people by far supported Biden's policies. But because Biden has been such a terrible messenger, and because people still, and this is to me the biggest worry. If you ask me what's one stat that worries me more than anything about this election, 2/3 of people voting in this election have never experienced inflation. And you ladies, of course, are probably too young to remember it because you're such spring chickens. But for those of us that were alive in the late 70s, we remember 18% inflation. We remember the prime hitting 20% in early 1980. And even though I think 70% of it was supply chains and about 20% of it was Biden's fault and about 10% of it was happened during Trump, the bottom line is it doesn't matter. It's personal. It's a gut punch. And that is the thing that I think is hurting Biden more than anything else, because the economy, by all metrics, is doing great. I remember Carrie, on so many times during our show, you said, oh, if we're not in a recession, we're going to be in one soon. We had the so-called soft landing. But the bottom line is perception trumps reality, pardon the pun.
No, but Dave, 20% inflation cumulative over Joe Biden's term.
Yes, and 22% wage increase over Joe Biden's term. So wages have gone up faster than inflation.
No, they haven't.
It doesn't matter. Yes, they have, but I don't want to argue.
It's been
the point is perception.
3%.
Mom feels it at the grocery store. Dad feels it at the gas pump. So, and this is where the administration, by the way, I think has gone wrong. You can't talk to people where you think things should be or where you want them to be or where if your great policies were being appreciated, they would be. You have to talk to people where they are. And that has been a failure of the administration. You know, unlike you, I'm the one who looks at both sides fairly. And I think if if they lose, it's going to be because of that, and because I think, we said before, I think Harris made a terrible mistake picking Tim Walz. I think she should have picked Josh Shapiro or a military guy. But if she
Well,
loses the election, those are the two reasons that she will lose, because this is a very winnable election, and the
I think
biggest coalition in this country is the anti-Trump coalition.
I think if Trump loses, it will be because of the early voting. Like the fact that we're here, uh, a few days out from the election, and more than 40 million people have already voted, and those ballots are leaning
A
female
lot more Republicans, by the way.
compared to the past. But even still, that's what makes me nervous. What about you, Mandy? What do you think about the Republican Party when it comes to the mail-in balloting, early voting? Have they caught up with the Democrats?
Yeah, I do. They've invested a lot in the infrastructure, both the ground game political infrastructure as well as the legal game. And so I actually feel more confident. I wouldn't say overly confident. It's cautious optimism in a lot of this, but there were a lot of problems that manifested itself at the 2020 election, and there were not sophisticated teams ready to go to file challenges in time, to make the arguments that needed to be made on the ground. And so they have learned from that, and also realized that mail-in voting, telling your voters not to engage in the pregame is not great for the ultimate outcome, because you go into election day. I'm not going to know these numbers off the top of my head, but you go into election day, you're already at a deficit, so you need your people to show up plus some, to actually get it back to where it already is. So I think they've done a great job building out the infrastructure across the board. The communication game is really strong, and then encouraging people to go to swampthevoteusa.com or org. I forget exactly what it is, but they have, and then the state derivatives of that, directing people where to go if they want to engage in early voting, and then how to actually do that so ballots don't end up getting counted because you didn't seal it the right way, or sign the signature across the seal, or put the vote in the envelope. All these little things that at the end of the day ultimately do matter. So I feel pretty confident. I know that in some states Republicans still trail, but was it Arizona or Nevada? Maybe y'all were looking at this more so than I, but there was only a 1 point differential between early voting, and at this time, in 2020 there was a 17 point differential. So I do think that really does matter, and I'm excited about that.
Well, and I think that, first of all, let's take a step back. What's the main reason that Republicans have fallen so far behind in early voting? Because Donald Trump crapped on it. The Republicans would have been in charge of the Senate, because David Perdue is my favorite stat, which Carrie's heard before. David Perdue got 49.7% of the vote in the election, but because Trump had crapped on early voting, about 30,000 fewer people voted in the general than they did in the primary. And then both senators won, the Democrats, in the runoff, because fewer people voted in the runoff than had voted in the general. And so, again, this is a problem, like so many problems the party had, that Trump created. But the big question for early voting is, how many of these voters were voters that aren't going to show up on election day, that are just voting early because they had the chance to? And that's the question,
Yeah.
that we won't know until the actual election. But I will certainly say I'm just happy to see more people voting. I don't care how they do it. And it's also worth pointing out that the states that have the highest mail-in voting, voter fraud is a BS thing anyway. It's a classic conservative solution in search of a problem. But the two states that have some of the highest mail-in voting, Oregon and Colorado, have some of the lowest fraud. So it's a very safe way to do it. And I hope more people will engage in doing it, because the more people that vote, the better. Carrie?
Well, I think we actually got to wrap because we've kept Mandy for too long, but I wanted to give her a chance just to talk a little bit more about her book.
Yes, please, Mandy.
Why did you write it? What are your main takeaways that you want people to get?
Yeah, well, this is so much fun. But yes, thank you for the segue to the book. I wrote it for two reasons. One of them being when I went in as an appointee in 2017, I was looking for a book to give me some sort of indication of what it was going to be like going in, and there really wasn't a lot of information out there. I did read a book. It's written by Anne Burford Gorsuch. She was Reagan's first EPA administrator. She too was run out by the deep state. But she had published a book. It's called Are You Tough Enough? And that was recommended for me to read. And I read it, and it's a really interesting story, but it didn't have a lot of practical application. So I wrote this book, number one, to be that guide or that source for a new or aspiring political appointee that's going in. And I also wrote it because the problem of the deep state, and I know that word can be triggering for a variety of reasons, but it is this entrenched civil servant that, under the guise of doing something that's really important to our democracy, they abuse it for either personal gain or political gain. And I think that is problematic across the board. And I feel very strongly about this. I mean, I was on the receiving end of personalized harassment. I was put in a sex hotel in Germany when I was sent to go do actual negotiations for an international agreement, but the State Department, I pissed some of them off because I was implementing policy direction from the administrator and the president. I had upset them, and the way that they were going to get even with me was to put me in a sex hotel 45 minutes away from the actual negotiations were supposed to take place. Just on a baseline, from a professional perspective, that's totally unacceptable, but nothing happened. And that's the problem. The problem is a lack of accountability, whether it's something personally focused on me or you have agencies like EPA being used not to institute their mission, which is to protect public health and the environment, but to engage in economic engineering and pick and choose what industries will thrive and what will ultimately be shut down, or even more personal than that, what businesses will get a permit to operate or expand and which ones will not. And what I saw, it's a very objective process that has been infiltrated by personal goals or politics, and there's no business of that. So I feel very strongly. I had an interesting purview because my first role was more technical. My second role was as chief of staff. So I had that
So
broad sweeping
you're
view.
chief of staff to Scott Pruitt
I was the chief of staff to Andrew Wheeler. For
and
Scott Pruitt, I served as his principal deputy in the Office
okay.
of Air and Radiation, and was a senior advisor early on until we shifted to those more formal roles. But nonetheless, I had various roles, and from that, I just got to see the problem of an unaccountable bureaucrat making a decision to the detriment of someone or some entity that has no real path to recourse. Yes,
Mhm.
there's the judiciary, you can challenge it, but that takes years. And if you're talking about investments or capital, for a lot of people, they can have that sideline for a seriously extended amount of time. The EPA understands that. I also saw corruption between some of these mega corporations that have these cozy relationships with the bureaucrats that oversee their regulatory standards, and they would use that relationship to set standards they could meet, but it makes it harder for the mid-size or the smaller guys to comply. And they would use that as a means to squeeze them out of business and protect or expand the mega corporations' market share. And again, that let that competition occur in the marketplace. Don't abuse the regulatory tools meant to establish clean standards as a tool in those relative gains. So a lot of experience saw it. It's a major problem, but I also wanted to offer a practical path of what can a president do to actually shrink the size and scope of the federal government. And I want to make this clear because I got into a bit of an argument the other day with someone who's a part of the conservative movement. The goal and the recommendations of the policy recommendations, they aren't to get rid of civil servants and then replace it with some hyper politicized expanded group of individuals. It's just to get rid of those roles and offices altogether, to truly shrink the size and scope of the
And
federal government.
who should make the decision about who goes?
So it should be done. You need to hire an auditor, like a
Like
major auditor. But
Elon Musk, that's going to be one of his roles.
yeah, I mean,
That doesn't strike fear into people. I don't know what does. Talk about the fox watching the hen house. Who has more government contracts? This again just gets back to the endemic corruption of the Trump administration.
But I think the test, if you're asking me what the test should be, it's not about particular people. And that's what I make clear in my book. Despite being on the receiving end of personal harassment, it's not going after people personally. It is fixing the institution, and the filter should be, does the office and the roles within that office tangibly implement the stated mission of that agency. Every agency has a stated mission, and they have delegated statutory authority from Congress. But there's a lot of superfluous offices that have been created, and that creates waste. It creates duplication. It undermines the ability to make clear policy goals, to communicate those within the agency. You get siloed organizations. Even at EPA, the Office of Air doesn't talk to the Office of Water. So if you're talking about an issue that impacts both, you may have differing and competing approaches to addressing the problem. There's a lot of fundamental problems that could be corrected if you're willing to go in and apply an objective lens that first, we
Yes.
need less of this.
Yes.
And we need to get rid of it so that the agencies are fulfilling their mission to the betterment of the American people, and they're not susceptible to political influence or being co-opted or distracted by personal gain.
I understand. Well, you said this all. It all sounds great on paper, but the key word you said, objective lens, and I don't think that anyone is going to use those two words when it comes to the Trump administration. I think when you look at the record, I've always said, look, if you want to not have any new existing regulations, that's fine. But existing regulations are priced into a corporation's business model. So some of the things the Trump administration did, like, gutting wetlands protection. And then he went into the people of the oil and gas industry and said, hey, give me a big contribution and I'll do your bidding. So I think that if you look at the past record and you look at the what you're seeing in terms of canaries in the coal mine, so to speak, I think that one should be worried. But Mandy, it's so great to have you on the show. And as you can tell, things are always spirited but civil around here. We wish you so much luck with your book. And I love Mississippi. It's a neat place. I was actually engaged from a woman who's from there, so I spent a fair amount of time there. Some of the friendliest people you'll ever meet, and you fit right into that category. So thanks so much for coming on. And Carrie, any final thoughts?
Get out to vote. Whoever.
There you go. Let's leave it at that. Well, thanks again to all of you for joining us on Practically Political. And until next time, I'm Dave Spencer.
I'm Carrie Sheffield. Catch you soon.